Judy Garland was a national treasure, a money-making machine that sustained MGM's dominance in the 1940s. But her marriage to the powerful director Vincente Minnelli was a cruel trap, stained with blood and tranquilizers orchestrated by the capitalists. Seeing his prodigy suffering from psychological breakdown due to over-exploitation, tyrant Louis B. Mayer immediately issued a disgusting matchmaking order. The system thrust the young woman into a lavender marriage with the director himself, who harbored a secret homosexual life within the studio. The ruthless tycoons exploited the innocence and yearning for love of a starlet to create a facade for her husband. They forced her to shoulder the burden of a deceitful family, depriving her of the right to happiness, all to maintain the illusion of box office success and tie her money-making tool to the camera. The environment that manufactured her was dictated by the absolute rule of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. In the 1930s, MGM was not merely a film production company. It was a sovereign state ruled by Louis B. Mayer. Mayer championed saccharine family values on screen, but behind closed doors, he operated with the ruthless pragmatism of an industrial baron. He viewed the actors under his control not as artists, but as incredibly valuable livestock requiring strict management to ensure a high return on investment. Judy Garland was inducted into this totalitarian system as a teenager, essentially traded from a relentless stage mother to an infinitely more powerful manager. She possessed a booming, emotionally resonant contralto that seemed impossible for her small frame, but pure talent was not enough. Surrounded by the statuesque porcelain beauty of stars like Greta Garbo and Joan Crawford, the normal, healthy teenager was deemed physically defective by the executives. Mayer cruelly branded her the ugly duckling, forcing her to wear restrictive teeth caps, rubber nose discs, and tight chest binders. The studio systematically programmed an adolescent girl to hate her own body, teaching her that her immense talent was the only thing preventing her from being discarded. This manufactured insecurity created a perfectly compliant star, one who would never refuse a grueling schedule or demand basic humanity from her corporate masters. But psychological manipulation was only the first layer of control. To extract the maximum amount of labor from their young investment, MGM resorted to a systemic state-sponsored program of chemical dependency. The production schedules at MGM were unrelenting. The studio operated like an assembly line, churning out dozens of features a year. When Garland was paired with Mickey Rooney to create a series of incredibly lucrative backyard musicals like Babes in Arms and Strike Up the Band, the demands on their time became physically impossible to sustain naturally. They were expected to be on set before dawn, spend hours in hair and makeup, and then sing, dance, and emote under incredibly hot, heavy studio lighting until late into the evening. They were then expected to attend vocal coaching, dance rehearsals, and wardrobe fittings. To ensure their young stars could maintain this punishing pace without collapsing from exhaustion, the studio's medical department intervened. The studio doctors, acting on the implicit or explicit orders of the executives, began prescribing a daily regimen of powerful narcotics to Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney. To sustain 18-hour workdays, studio doctors handed the exhausted teenagers amphetamines, colloquially known as pep pills. Fueled entirely by pharmaceutical speed, Garland performed complex routines while her body screamed for rest. However, when the lights turned off, her chemically wired nervous system prevented her from sleeping. To counter this, doctors provided the second half of the regimen, powerful barbiturates. They essentially sedated her into an artificial coma for a few hours before the 4 a.m. alarm rang. When she woke up groggy and disoriented, the amphetamines were waiting to start the cycle all over again. The doctors would hand her the amphetamines to wake her up and get her back in front of the cameras. This was not a temporary measure to get through a difficult week of shooting. This was standard operating procedure. This was the chemical foundation upon which the greatest musical career of the 20th century was built. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was systematically addicting a legally underage girl to a lethal combination of uppers and downers to maximize her output and their profit margins. They were short-circuiting her developing nervous system, permanently altering her brain chemistry, and setting a ticking time bomb inside her body. And simultaneously they were enforcing a strict starvation-level diet. Because the camera allegedly added 10 pounds, and because Mayer was obsessed with keeping her looking like a slender adolescent, Garland was frequently restricted to a daily intake of chicken soup, black coffee, and dozens of cigarettes to suppress her appetite. The amphetamines conveniently also aided in weight loss. She was starving, exhausted, and chemically manipulated, yet expected to project absolute radiant joy on demand. This toxic regimen reached its apex during the production of the film that would immortalize her, The Wizard of Oz. Released in 1939 when Garland was just 17 years old, the film was a cinematic triumph that cemented her status as a global icon. When she sang Over the Rainbow, leaning against a haystack in a sepia-toned Kansas farmyard, she captured a profound sense of longing that resonated with a world standing on the brink of global war. The performance was flawless. The innocence was palpable. But the reality of the set was a nightmare. Garland was bound tightly in a corset to flatten her chest, making her look younger than her 17 years. She was surrounded by older, hardened character actors who frequently bullied her. The director, Victor Fleming, famously slapped her across the face when she could not stop giggling during a take, a brutal assertion of authority designed to force her back into the required emotional state. And all the while the cycle of pep pills and sleeping pills continued unabated, managed by her mother and the studio physicians. The Wizard of Oz propelled Judy Garland into the stratosphere of fame. She won a Special Academy Juvenile Award. She became the most bankable star on the MGM lot. Her films routinely grossed millions of dollars, effectively keeping the studio solvent during lean years. She was the golden goose. But the higher she climbed in the estimation of the public, the further she descended into the labyrinth of her own physical and mental degradation. As the 1930s bled into the 1940s, the teenager transitioned into a young woman. The brutal regimen that she had somehow survived in her youth began to exact a terrible compounding toll on her adult body. You cannot systematically drug and starve a human being for a decade without consequence. The biological bill inevitably comes due. By the time she reached her early 20s, Judy Garland was a woman functioning on borrowed time and artificial energy. The physical symptoms of her systemic abuse could no longer be easily hidden by makeup or clever lighting. She suffered from chronic insomnia, unable to achieve even a few hours of rest without heavy doses of barbiturates. She experienced severe, debilitating migraines. Her weight fluctuated wildly, a physical manifestation of her shattered metabolism and her desperate attempts to self-soothe with food when she wasn't being monitored, followed by extreme crash diets mandated by the studio. More alarmingly for MGM, the psychological cracks were beginning to show, and they were beginning to affect the production schedules. Garland began to suffer from severe anxiety attacks, paralyzing bouts of stage fright, and deep, suffocating depression. The woman whose voice commanded millions was terrified of standing in front of a camera. She began arriving late to the set, holding up productions that cost tens of thousands of dollars a day. There were mornings when she simply could not get out of bed, physically and emotionally paralyzed by the sheer weight of her existence. She would lock herself in her dressing room, weeping uncontrollably, unable to remember her lines or execute the complex choreography she was once known for. She was labeled difficult, unreliable, and temperamental by the directors and executives who were entirely responsible for her condition. The industry press began to run blind items about her erratic behavior. The whispers on the Culver City lot were that Judy was losing her mind. When Garland's physical and mental breakdown began threatening production schedules, a responsible employer would have mandated immediate medical intervention and rehabilitation. But MGM was not a charity. Sending their top star to a sanitarium meant halting lucrative productions, losing millions in projected revenue, and shattering the studio's pristine, family-friendly image. They couldn't afford a public relations disaster. The studio fixers, the lawyers, and the executives needed a different kind of solution. They needed a mechanism to stabilize their asset without taking her off the assembly line. They needed to find a way to manage her anxiety, control her behavior, and keep her returning to the soundstage every morning without addressing the root causes of her trauma. They didn't need a doctor. They needed a warden. They needed a structure that would enforce domestic compliance and project an image of absolute heteronormative stability to the outside world. They looked at the fractured, desperately lonely young woman who had spent her entire life yearning for the stable family environment she had never possessed. They understood her deep-seated psychological need to be loved, to be protected, and to fit into the conventional mold of American womanhood that she portrayed in her films. And they realized they could use her own desperate desires against her. They could manufacture a solution that would serve as both a public relations triumph and a private psychological prison. Instead of arranging an appointment with a psychiatrist, the studio environment fostered a dynamic where a high-profile marriage appeared as a solution to her instability. The executives laid the groundwork for a strategic union masquerading as a Hollywood romance. The man chosen to anchor her and ultimately act as her warden was a brilliant, highly respected, and deeply compromised director named Vincente Minnelli. Unlike the ruthless businessmen running MGM, Minnelli was a visionary artist with extraordinary aesthetic sensitivity. However, he carried a liability that was essentially a ticking time bomb in the aggressively homophobic climate of 1940s Hollywood. While his private life had been an open secret in the bohemian theatrical circles of New York, crossing into Mayer's factory of traditional American morality meant navigating a terrifying tightrope. The morals clause applied strictly to directors, meaning any rumors regarding his sexuality would result in immediate termination and blacklisting. To survive and protect his multi-million-dollar career, Minnelli desperately needed a shield, an unassailable public declaration of heteronormative compliance. It is within this high-stakes environment of mutual vulnerability that the paths of Vincente Minnelli and Judy Garland were deliberately, strategically crossed. The studio executives, observing the rapid deterioration of their most valuable female star and recognizing the looming public relations vulnerability of their most talented director, identified a ruthless synergy. They saw an opportunity to solve two massive corporate liabilities with a single, highly publicized contract, a marriage license. To execute this, the studio did not simply order them into a room and demand they marry. The manipulation was far more sophisticated, psychological, and insidious. They weaponized Judy Garland's deepest insecurities to ensure she would walk into the trap willingly. The mechanism of this manipulation was the 1944 production of the masterpiece film Meet Me in St. Louis. When Garland was initially assigned to the film, she was exhausted, heavily medicated, and deeply resistant. She was in her early 20s and desperately wanted to transition into mature, dramatic roles. Instead, the studio was forcing her to play another teenager, a nostalgic throwback to the adolescent characters she despised. She arrived on set defensive, combative, and teetering on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Vincente Minnelli was assigned to direct, and Minnelli did something that no director and certainly no executive at MGM had ever done for Judy Garland before. He treated her with absolute, unwavering aesthetic respect. Minnelli recognized that Garland had been traumatized by the studio's relentless criticism of her physical appearance. He knew about the rubber nose discs, the teeth caps, and the psychological abuse inflicted by Louis B. Mayer. Minnelli immediately discarded the studio's standard operating procedure. He brought in a new trusted makeup artist, Dorothy Ponadel, and gave her a specific directive: remove all the artificial prosthetics. Minnelli altered the lighting. He redesigned the costumes and he framed the camera angles to highlight Garland's natural features. He did not try to force her into the mold of a porcelain statue. He used his genius for color and shadow to capture the expressive, haunting beauty of her actual face. When Garland viewed the daily rushes, the unedited footage of the previous day's filming, she was stunned. For the first time in her life, looking at a screen, she did not see the little hunchback or the ugly duckling that Mayer had programmed her to believe she was. She saw a beautiful, radiant, desirable woman. The psychological impact of this aesthetic validation on a deeply insecure, chemically dependent 21-year-old cannot be overstated. Garland, starved of genuine affection and desperate for approval, entirely conflated Minnelli's directorial brilliance with profound personal love. She viewed Minnelli as her savior. He was older, 32 at the time, sophisticated, soft-spoken, and possessed a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the manic, terrifying energy of the studio bosses. He did not yell at her. He guided her. He made her look beautiful, and in the tragic, distorted logic of a woman raised in captivity, she believed that meant he could finally provide her with the safety and the family she had never known. For Minnelli, Garland represented the ultimate, undeniable proof of his masculinity. She was America's sweetheart. If the man who directed Meet Me in St. Louis was also the man who won the heart of the girl who sang The Boy Next Door, the whispers regarding his private life in New York would be permanently silenced. The studio executives watched this dynamic unfold on the set with immense satisfaction. The corporate merger was falling into place exactly as they had engineered it. While Hollywood often utilized mutually agreed upon marriages of convenience to protect gay actors, the Garland-Minnelli arrangement was infinitely more cruel. It was built on an asymmetrical foundation of truth. While historical consensus strongly suggests that Minnelli was aware he was utilizing the marriage as a necessary protective covering for his own sexuality, Judy Garland walked into the arrangement completely, heartbreakingly blind. She was not a willing participant in a public relations strategy. She was a genuine, desperate believer in the illusion. She believed she was entering a traditional romantic partnership that would cure her anxiety, replace her dependency on the studio, and finally grant her a normal life. The studio executives knew this was a psychological impossibility, but they allowed her to believe the lie because the lie kept her showing up for work. The marriage served as a psychological pacifier, a corporate sedative administered to keep the golden goose laying eggs. The studio fixers understood that if Garland was focused on planning a wedding, decorating a home, and playing the role of the devoted wife, she would be distracted from the crushing reality of her addiction and her exhaustion. On June 15, 1945, the trap was officially legally sprung. The wedding of Judy Garland and Vincente Minnelli was a major cultural event, managed with the precision of a military operation by the MGM Publicity Department. The head of Publicity, Howard Strickling, ensured that every major magazine and newspaper received perfectly staged, radiant photographs of the happy couple. The most grotesque, chilling detail of the ceremony was the man who walked Judy Garland down the aisle. Because her own father had passed away years earlier, she was given away by her boss. Louis B. Mayer walking her down the aisle was less a paternal gesture and more a formal transfer of the daily management of his most valuable asset to a trusted employee, publicly sealing the contract that protected them both. Following the wedding, the MGM publicity machine shifted into overdrive. They spoon-fed the American public a relentless narrative of domestic tranquility. Magazines featured glossy spreads of Judy and Vincente in their beautiful, newly purchased home. They ran stories about Judy learning to cook, about Vincente designing the interior decor, about the perfect synergy of the genius director and his devoted, talented muse. The birth of their daughter, Liza Minnelli, in 1946, was treated as the ultimate validation of this narrative. The studio utilized the child to further cement the illusion, projecting the image of a complete, flawless Hollywood family. But the glossy magazine pages could not mask the terrifying reality of what was actually happening inside the walls of their home. The studio's reliance on a marriage to act as a psychological pacifier was a catastrophic miscalculation. A highly publicized domestic facade could not cure her chronic insomnia, heal her traumatized nervous system, or rewrite the private desires of her husband. The honeymoon period, fueled by Garland's desperate optimism and Minnelli's initial affection, was agonizingly brief. The structural integrity of the illusion began to buckle almost immediately under the weight of their respective unaddressed realities. Garland had expected a traditional husband, a man who would act as a firm anchor against the chaotic storms of her anxiety. She expected a romantic, physically, and emotionally present partner, but Minnelli, despite his artistic brilliance, was entirely incapable of fulfilling that specific role. He was a man consumed by his work, deeply introverted and living a compartmentalized existence. The pressure of maintaining the facade of the traditional American patriarch while suppressing his own authentic nature and managing the increasingly erratic behavior of his heavily addicted wife forced him to retreat. He became emotionally distant, burying himself in the visual details of his upcoming films, avoiding the messy, loud, and terrifying reality of his wife's deteriorating mental state. This emotional withdrawal was catastrophic for Garland. She had been promised a sanctuary. She had been led to believe that this marriage was the cure for her profound loneliness. When she found herself sitting in a beautiful, impeccably designed house with a husband who was emotionally absent and physically distant, the betrayal cut deeper than anything she had experienced on the studio lot. The anxiety that the marriage was supposed to pacify returned with a vengeance, amplified by the terror of a new failure. If the ultimate Hollywood romance could not save her, she believed nothing could. Her reliance on the studio-instituted pharmaceutical regimen skyrocketed. The amphetamines required for grueling shoots like The Pirate made her volatile, while massive doses of barbiturates left her severely depressed. The home photographed as a haven of domestic bliss became a fractured, high-stress environment, punctuated by her physical and mental collapses. Vincente Minnelli, trapped in a situation he was fundamentally ill-equipped to handle, frequently chose the path of avoidance. He could direct hundreds of extras on a sound stage, but he could not direct the chaos inside his own living room. He left the management of his wife's medical and psychological crises to the studio doctors and the MGM fixers. The marriage was failing. The pressures of the industry and their fundamental incompatibilities quickly fractured the domestic facade the studio had aggressively promoted. The studio executives watched the deterioration with mounting panic. Their sedative pill had not worked. Garland was becoming more unreliable than ever. The production of The Pirate went massively over budget, largely due to Garland's frequent absences, her inability to perform, and her increasingly fragile mental state. The very marriage that was engineered to keep her on the assembly line was now accelerating her breakdown. The facade was cracking, visible to the crew, the executives, and the inner circle of the Hollywood elite. But the public was kept entirely in the dark. The publicity department continued to churn out the narrative of the happy couple, desperately trying to maintain the commercial viability of their stars. But a lie of this magnitude could not be sustained indefinitely. The tension within the marriage was stretching toward an inevitable snapping point, and the carefully constructed illusion was about to shatter. The house on Vanview Drive, nestled high in the affluent winding hills above the Sunset Strip, was designed to be a masterpiece. Vincente Minnelli, a man whose entire cinematic reputation was built upon his flawless, obsessive control over visual aesthetics, had personally overseen the decoration of the marital home. It was a sprawling, sophisticated estate filled with carefully curated antiques, bold color palettes, and dramatic lighting fixtures that mimicked the precision of an MGM soundstage. It was, in every conceivable way, a breathtaking environment. But for Judy Garland, this impeccable residence was rapidly transforming into an immaculate, terrifyingly silent museum. She was the prized exhibit, but she was entirely alone in the display case. By the late 1940s, the domestic reality inside the Garland-Minnelli household was unraveling into a suffocating environment. The illusion of the family, so aggressively marketed by the studio's publicity department, was beginning to tear at the seams. Garland had entered the marriage with a desperate, almost childlike yearning for a traditional sanctuary. She wanted the mythical, normal American life that she had spent her adolescence portraying on screen. She wanted a husband who would anchor her, protect her from the predatory executives at the studio, and provide a buffer against the crushing, chemical-induced anxiety that dictated her every waking moment. Vincente Minnelli was categorically incapable of fulfilling this role. This was not necessarily born of malicious intent, but of a fundamental, unbridgeable incompatibility exacerbated by a life-altering secret. Minnelli was an intensely private, highly compartmentalized individual. He lived in his own head, consumed by the artistic demands of his upcoming films. More crucially, he was a man living in hiding. In the ruthlessly homophobic ecosystem of 1940s Los Angeles, a gay or bisexual man in a position of power was forced to maintain a state of constant, exhausting vigilance. The marriage to Garland provided him with the ultimate camouflage, but it also trapped him in a daily performance of heteronormative domesticity that he found inherently alienating. As Garland's reliance on barbiturates and amphetamines escalated, a direct result of the studio's punishing production schedules and her own untreated trauma, her behavior became increasingly volatile. She required immense emotional support, patience, and psychiatric intervention. Minnelli, ill-equipped and unwilling to navigate the terrifying depths of his wife's addiction, chose the path of least resistance. He withdrew. He retreated into his work, spending long hours at the studio, and when he was at home, he often isolated himself in his study. The emotional distance between them grew into a vast, unnavigable chasm. Garland, acutely sensitive to rejection and terrified of abandonment, interpreted his withdrawal as a failure on her part. She believed she was not beautiful enough, not talented enough, not normal enough to hold her husband's affection. She did not know, because she had not been told, that the game was rigged from the very beginning. She was fighting a losing battle against a truth she could not even see. The tension in the house on Evanview Drive became a palpable, suffocating force. It was a pressure cooker waiting for a spark. And according to historical records, most notably detailed by the definitive Garland biographer Gerald Clark, that spark arrived with devastating, undeniable clarity. The precise timeline of events in Hollywood lore is often blurred by studio interference and decades of rumor, but the core narrative of the incident remains one of the most tragic and pivotal moments in entertainment history. It was an ordinary day in Los Angeles. Garland had either returned home early from the studio or had been resting at the estate. The house was supposed to be quiet. She walked through the meticulously decorated hallways, perhaps looking for her husband, perhaps simply moving through the domestic space she believed was her sanctuary. She opened the door to a bedroom. What Judy Garland witnessed shattered her reality. She found her husband Vincente Minnelli, the brilliant director and the father of her child, in bed with another man. Historical accounts, including Clark's extensive research, suggest the other man was an employee, possibly a handyman or a staff member who worked in or around their estate. For Garland, the revelation was entirely destructive. It meant her marriage was a corporate fiction. The man she had looked to as a savior was utilizing her as a heavily medicated human shield to protect his career, colluding with the studio to lock her in a cage of deceit. Garland did not scream. She did not fly into a violent, theatrical rage. The shock was too absolute, the humiliation too profound for anger. The betrayal bypassed her defense mechanisms entirely and struck directly at the core of her already fragile will to live. She retreated. She turned away from the bedroom, carrying the crushing weight of a truth that she knew instinctively she would never be allowed to speak aloud. She walked into a bathroom in the house. She locked the heavy wooden door behind her, shutting out the immaculate, terrifyingly false world her husband had designed. Garland had been denied bodily autonomy since childhood. The studio controlled her diet, her sleep, her medication, and her career. This discovery proved she had no control over her own family either. Trapped without psychological support, Garland locked herself in a bathroom and slashed her wrists. It was not a theatrical gesture, but the desperate act of a woman pushed beyond her limits, seeking an escape from a reality she could no longer endure. But the machinery of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer did not halt. It simply shifted into crisis management mode. When the blood was discovered and the locked bathroom door was breached, the response was not governed by medical ethics or human compassion. It was governed by the cold, ruthless protocols of corporate protection. In a normal household, a suicide attempt triggers an immediate call for an ambulance, a rush to a hospital, and the intervention of psychiatric professionals. The police are notified. It becomes a matter of public medical record. But Evanview Drive was not a normal household, and Judy Garland was not a normal citizen. If an ambulance arrived at the estate with sirens wailing, the tabloid press would know within the hour. If Garland was admitted to a public psychiatric ward, the news would be flashed across the globe by morning. The headlines would destroy the wholesome image of MGM's greatest star. Worse, the subsequent investigation or divorce proceedings might unearth the catalyst for the suicide attempt, Vincente Minnelli's homosexuality. If Minnelli's secret was exposed, his career would be instantly terminated under the morals clause, and the multi-million-dollar musical productions he was slated to direct would be thrown into chaos. The financial exposure for the studio was astronomical. Therefore, the police were not called. The public hospital was not notified. Instead, the call went out to the MGM fixers. Enter Howard Strickling. Howard Strickling was the formidable head of publicity at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, but his actual job title severely understates his power. He was Louis B. Mayer's chief fixer and protector. He commanded a vast network of studio-employed doctors, private investigators, compliant police officers, and paid-off journalists. His sole responsibility was to ensure that the gods and goddesses of the MGM pantheon appeared flawless to the ticket-buying public, regardless of the blood, addiction, and criminality that occurred behind closed doors. Strickling's team descended upon the Evanview Drive estate with the efficiency of a military cleanup crew. They bypassed the standard emergency services entirely. They brought in trusted, studio-affiliated physicians, the same type of doctors who readily prescribed the amphetamines and barbiturates that had fueled Garland's addiction in the first place. These doctors worked for the corporation, not for the patient. They breached the bathroom. They found the bleeding, semi-conscious star. They did not offer her psychiatric counseling. They treated her physical wounds with clinical detachment. They stitched the lacerations on her wrists, applied heavy bandages, and administered further sedatives to keep her quiet and compliant. Simultaneously, Strickling's operatives went to work on the environment. They scrubbed the bathroom. They secured the perimeter of the house. They intimidated the domestic staff, enforcing ironclad non-disclosure agreements with threats of permanent blacklisting and financial ruin. Anyone who had seen the blood or anyone who knew about the man in Minnelli's bed was silenced through fear or bribery. The studio then engineered the cover story. Strickling's office drafted a press release and fed it to friendly columnists like Luella Parsons. The narrative was sanitized, clinical, and entirely false. The public was informed that Miss Judy Garland was suffering from nervous exhaustion due to her incredible dedication to her craft and her rigorous filming schedule. They reported that she had experienced a minor accident or a brief fainting spell at home and was resting comfortably under the care of her loving husband and private physicians. The public swallowed the lie whole. The machinery operated flawlessly. Judy Garland woke up from the sedatives. She was bandaged, weakened, and psychologically decimated. She had attempted to end her own life because the reality of her fake marriage and her profound isolation had become intolerable. And what was the studio's response? What was the reaction of the executives who had orchestrated this entire tragedy? They demanded she return to work. There was no grace period. There was no 6-month sabbatical at a Swiss clinic. There was no permission granted to divorce the man who had caused the catastrophic trauma. The studio had schedules to meet. Films like The Pirate and later Easter Parade had massive budgets attached to them, and the overhead costs of a delayed production were unacceptable to the shareholders in New York. Garland was informed explicitly or implicitly that she had no choice. The studio held her contract, they controlled her finances, and they held the power to destroy her reputation if she rebelled. She was ordered to swallow her humiliation, push her grief down into the dark, chemical void of her addiction, and get back in front of the cameras. Garland was forced to leave the house where she had tried to die, travel to the Culver City lot, and step onto a soundstage. She was sent into the hair and makeup department, where the studio artists applied thick theatrical foundation to cover the dark circles under her eyes. But more horrifyingly, the wardrobe department had to make specific logistical adjustments to accommodate her trauma. They designed costumes with long sleeves. They provided her with elegant elbow-length gloves. These were not aesthetic choices. They were strategic concealments. The gloves and the sleeves were required to hide the fresh, thick bandages wrapped around her stitched wrists. And then she was forced to walk onto the set and take direction from her husband. Vincente Minnelli, the man she had caught in bed with another man, the man whose secret life had driven her to the razor blade, was sitting in the director's chair. He was calling action. He was dictating her movements, analyzing her performance, and demanding that she project joy, energy, and musical brilliance for the camera. She had to look into the eyes of the man who had shattered her reality, and she had to sing. They did not just exploit her talent, they weaponized her trauma. They forced a suicidal, heavily addicted woman to perform alongside her abuser, utilizing long gloves to hide the evidence of her despair, all to ensure that the musical numbers were delivered on time and under budget. Every time Judy Garland smiled on screen during this period, every time she executed a flawless dance routine or hit a soaring emotional note, she was performing an act of unimaginable, agonizing endurance. The audience in the dark theaters across America saw a radiant, talented star. They did not see the heavy bandages beneath the silk sleeves. They did not see the terror in her eyes when the director called, "Cut." They did not see the studio doctors waiting in the wings with the next dose of barbiturates to numb the pain when the shooting day was over. The marriage, which had been designed as a psychological pacifier, had mutated into an instrument of profound psychological torture. Judy Garland was entirely trapped. She could not expose her husband without destroying her own career and facing the wrath of Louis B. Mayer. She could not leave the studio without facing financial ruin and breach of contract lawsuits. She was a hostage in a multi-million-dollar Technicolor prison. The suicide attempt and the subsequent ruthless cover-up marked the definitive point of no return for Judy Garland at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The fundamental trust between the artist and the studio, which had been eroding for years, was now completely and permanently destroyed. The executives viewed her not as a human being in crisis, but as a defective, unreliable piece of machinery that was becoming increasingly expensive to maintain. The machine had decided that she was a problem. And in the cold corporate logic of Louis B. Mayer's empire, when a piece of machinery becomes too problematic to fix, you do not offer it compassion. You squeeze the absolute final drops of utility out of it, and then you ruthlessly discard it. The final agonizing chapter of Garland's tenure at MGM was about to begin, and the men who had orchestrated her descent were preparing to wash their hands of the blood they had spilled. Garland's daily existence devolved into a grotesque pantomime. She was trapped in a three-dimensional prison constructed by her employers and reinforced by her legal spouse. Vincente Minnelli was the director. He held the position of absolute authority. He commanded the crew, dictated the lighting, and judged the quality of the performances. Judy Garland was his lead actress. When the cameras rolled, she had to look into the lens and project the vibrant, irrepressible energy that the public demanded. But when the director yelled, "Cut," the silence between the husband and wife must have been deafening. Minnelli knew that Garland knew his secret. Garland knew that Minnelli knew she had tried to die because of it. Yet neither was permitted to speak of it. They were bound by the ironclad, unspoken laws of the studio system. Protect the investment, maintain the illusion, and never, under any circumstances, allow the truth to disrupt the shooting schedule. They were two hostages guarding each other. Minnelli was hostage to the morals clause and the terrifying threat of public exposure. Garland was hostage to her contract, her chemical dependency, and a deep, entirely manufactured belief that she was fundamentally worthless without the studio's validation. In this environment of absolute, suffocating deceit, Garland's reliance on prescription narcotics ceased to be merely a tool for maintaining her grueling work schedule. The pills became her only reliable mechanism for psychological survival. She was no longer just taking amphetamines to wake up and barbiturates to sleep. She was taking them to numb the sheer horror of her reality. She needed the chemicals to suppress the memory of the man in her husband's bed, to ignore the throbbing pain of the scars on her wrist, and to endure the daily humiliation of pretending that her life was a Hollywood fairy tale. The medical regimen facilitated by the studio doctors escalated into a terrifying lethal cocktail. To combat the severe crushing depression that the marriage had triggered, she was given stronger stimulants. When the stimulants induced paranoia, auditory hallucinations, and violent mood swings, she was handed heavier sedatives. Paraldehyde, a harsh, foul-smelling central nervous system depressant, became a regular feature of her desperate attempts to find oblivion. The physical toll of this chemical bombardment was catastrophic. Garland's weight fluctuated wildly, a visible, undeniable symptom of her internal chaos. She would appear bloated and lethargic from the sedatives, prompting the studio executives to mandate brutal, starvation-level diets. Then, fueled by amphetamines, she would become frighteningly emaciated, her eyes wide and sunken, her frame fragile and trembling. The executives at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer watched this physical and mental disintegration not with compassion, but with mounting cold-blooded irritation. This is the ultimate defining gaslighting of the studio era. Louis B. Mayer and his lieutenants had created the monster. They had fed her the pills when she was a teenager. They had orchestrated the fake, traumatizing marriage. They had covered up her suicide attempt and denied her psychiatric care. Yet, when Garland began to exhibit the inevitable, undeniable symptoms of this systemic abuse, the studio blamed her. They did not label her a victim of corporate exploitation. They labeled her a problem. Studio memos from this period, preserved in historical archives, are chilling in their lack of basic human empathy. Executives complained bitterly about her tardiness, her erratic behavior, and her unprofessionalism. They tracked the minutes she was late to the set, calculating the financial loss to the studio with ruthless precision. Garland was developing a terrifying reputation within the industry, and it was a reputation engineered to isolate her further. The narrative pushed by the Studio Whisper Network was that Judy was simply difficult. She was a diva who could not handle her liquor or her pills. The men who were actively supplying her with the narcotics were the same men shaking their heads in executive boardrooms, lamenting her lack of discipline. The marriage to Minnelli, meanwhile, dissolved from a facade of domestic bliss into a state of cold, hostile cohabitation. They lived in the same immaculate house, but they occupied entirely different realities. Minnelli, conflict-averse and deeply absorbed in his own aesthetic visions, retreated further into his work. He could design a perfect, harmonious world on a soundstage, but he was utterly incapable of navigating the messy, chaotic, and desperately sad reality of his wife's decline. He effectively abandoned her to the studio fixers. He became just another employee of MGM, watching from the sidelines as the corporation slowly crushed the life out of the woman he had sworn to protect. By the late 1940s, Garland's ability to function as a reliable cog in the MGM machine was completely breaking down. Her body and her mind were actively staging a rebellion against the abuse. In 1948, she was assigned to star alongside Fred Astaire in The Barclays of Broadway. It was supposed to be a triumphant reunion, a guaranteed box office smash. But Garland was physically and mentally incapable of completing the assignment. She was missing rehearsals. She was heavily sedated, unable to learn the complex choreography. She would lock herself in her dressing room, weeping uncontrollably, paralyzed by a terror she could not articulate. The studio's response was swift and punitive. They did not offer her a leave of absence for medical rehabilitation. They suspended her. They pulled her from the picture, replacing her with Ginger Rogers, and cut off her salary. This was a brutal, calculated tactic designed to terrorize her into compliance. For a woman who had worked for the studio since she was a child, whose entire identity and financial security were tied to Louis B. Mayer, a suspension was the equivalent of excommunication. It was a threat of total annihilation. The suspension achieved its intended effect: absolute, terrifying compliance. Garland begged for her job back. She promised to be good. She promised to lose weight, to stop being difficult, and to adhere to the schedule. She internalized the abuse completely, believing that her failure to function under impossible chemically toxic conditions was a moral failing on her part. The studio eventually lifted the suspension and put her back to work, but the cycle of abuse simply accelerated. In 1949, they cast her in the grueling, highly demanding lead role of Annie Get Your Gun. It was a physically exhausting production, requiring horseback riding, complex musical numbers, and a relentless shooting schedule. For a woman whose nervous system was already shattered, it was a death sentence. Garland's collapse on the set of Annie Get Your Gun is one of the most thoroughly documented tragedies in Hollywood history. She was severely malnourished, subsisting on black coffee, cigarettes, and pills. She was suffering from migraine headaches so severe they blurred her vision. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold a prop. The director, Busby Berkeley, a man notorious for his tyrannical, uncompromising methods, showed her no mercy. He demanded endless takes, pushing her beyond the limits of human endurance. When she inevitably faltered, he berated her in front of the crew. During the production of Annie Get Your Gun, her physical and mental state collapsed completely. When her collapse halted the production of Annie Get Your Gun, MGM deployed their standard punishment, stripping her of the role, giving it to Betty Hutton, and instantly freezing her income. Frustrated by her unreliability, the studio executives decided she required a more aggressive intervention. With the implicit approval of the studio and the grim acquiescence of her husband, Vincente Minnelli, Judy Garland was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Boston. She was not sent there to heal from trauma. She was sent there to be fixed so she could be put back on the assembly line. The treatment she received was rooted in the harshest psychiatric practices of the era. Electroshock therapy was used as a blunt force instrument to reset difficult or depressed patients. For Garland, the procedure did not process her trauma or treat her addiction. It was an attempt to shock her back into a compliant, productive state. She returned from the hospital in Boston fragile, terrified, and fundamentally altered. The electroshock therapy had not cured her. It had merely added another layer of trauma to an already unbearable existence. She was deeply afraid of the studio, afraid of her husband, and afraid of her own mind. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, seeing that she was temporarily docile and seemingly cured of her rebellion, put her back to work. They cast her in the 1950 film Summerstock, starring Gene Kelly. The production of Summerstock was a grueling testament to Garland's sheer willpower. She was severely overweight, heavily medicated, and terrified of the camera. The director, Charles Walters, and her co-star, Gene Kelly, had to essentially drag her through the production. There were days when shooting had to be entirely suspended because Garland simply could not stand up. Yet, in a display of artistic genius that defies logical explanation, she managed to deliver one of the most iconic performances of her career. In the film's final number, Get Happy, Garland appears noticeably thinner, the result of a sudden brutal crash diet mandated by the studio. Wearing a tuxedo jacket and a black fedora, she sings and dances with an electric, mesmerizing precision. On screen, Garland delivered a legendary performance in Get Happy. Yet the flawless routine masked a severe physical and mental decline. It was not a celebration, but a desperate final surge of adrenaline to meet the studio's punishing demands before her ultimate collapse. Summerstock was the end of the line. The studio executives had watched the agonizing, expensive production process. They had seen the delays, the tears, and the sheer unpredictability of their former golden goose. Louis B. Mayer, the man who had walked her down the aisle, the man who had overseen her chemical dependency from childhood, finally looked at the balance sheet. He calculated the cost of her delays against the projected revenue of her future films. The math no longer worked in her favor. The assets had finally depreciated beyond repair. The psychological pacifier of her marriage had failed. The pills had failed. The electroshock therapy had failed. The machine was done with her. In September 1950, shortly after the completion of Summerstock, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer formally requested that Judy Garland clear out her dressing room. They did not offer a graceful retirement. They did not offer a severance package that reflected the hundreds of millions of dollars she had generated for the corporation. They simply terminated her contract. After 15 years of relentless, systematic exploitation, after being drugged, starved, lied to, and utilized as a human shield for a compromised director, America's ultimate national treasure was summarily fired. She was 28 years old. She was heavily addicted to narcotics, deeply traumatized, locked in a loveless, fraudulent marriage, and utterly, entirely alone. The gates of the Culver City lot, the only home she had ever truly known, swung shut behind her, locking her out in the cold. The empire she had built had decided she was no longer necessary, and the final devastating act of her life was about to begin. The heavy iron gates of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer lot in Culver City clanged shut in September 1950, sealing Judy Garland on the outside. For the general public, reading the sanitized press releases in the morning papers, it appeared to be the unfortunate but inevitable decline of a temperamental star. The closing of the Culver City gates was more than a firing. It was a psychological excommunication. For 15 years, MGM had not merely been Judy Garland's employer. It had been her entire universe. The studio had functioned as her father, her doctor, her bank, and her jailer. Louis B. Mayer had dictated what she wore, what she sang, what she ate, and ultimately who she married. The studio had infantilized her to such an absolute degree that at 28 years old, she possessed virtually no practical life skills. She did not know how to manage a checking account. She did not know how to negotiate a contract or book a flight. She was a feral child of the corporate entertainment machine, and suddenly the machine had unceremoniously dumped her onto the pavement. The asymmetry of the fallout regarding her marriage to Vincente Minnelli compounded this terrifying lack of autonomy. When Garland was fired, deemed a defective and unreliable piece of machinery, her husband remained safely, comfortably ensconced within the very executive structure that had just destroyed her. The marriage orchestrated by the studio to pacify Garland and protect Minnelli had achieved its primary corporate objective with ruthless efficiency. Vincente Minnelli's reputation was spotless. The whispers regarding his life in New York and his private inclinations in Hollywood had been permanently neutralized by the existence of his wife and his young daughter Liza. While Judy Garland was spiraling into a suicidal, drug-addicted abyss, a direct consequence of the impossible working conditions and the devastating betrayal she had discovered in their own bedroom. Minnelli's career was ascending to the stratosphere. Protected by the heteronormative shield that Garland's blood insanity had purchased, Minnelli remained a favored elite director at MGM. In the exact same era that his wife was being subjected to electroconvulsive therapy and unceremoniously fired, Minnelli was directing cinematic masterpieces. He would go on to direct An American in Paris, which would win the Academy Award for Best Picture, and later Gigi, which secured him the Academy Award for Best Director. The corporation protected the man who played by their rules, and it annihilated the woman whose nervous system had collapsed under the weight of their lies. Minnelli was allowed to flourish. Garland was left to die. The formal dissolution of their marriage in 1951 was a quiet, highly sanitized legal procedure. There were no explosive courtroom testimonies. There were no public accusations regarding the traumatic discovery on Evanview Drive. Garland, fundamentally broken and entirely dependent on the goodwill of the industry she hoped to one day re-enter, did not breathe a word of the truth to the press. She swallowed the betrayal whole. She accepted the narrative of irreconcilable differences and career pressures. She walked away from the marriage carrying the permanent psychological scars of a woman who had been utilized as a human prop, while the man who had utilized her walked away with his prestige, his career, and his studio backing entirely intact. Bereft of her studio, her husband, and her identity, the early 1950s became a terrifying wilderness for Judy Garland. She was a woman experiencing the horrific delayed withdrawal symptoms of a life lived entirely under corporate control. Without the studio doctors to manage her chemical intake, her addiction to barbiturates and amphetamines became chaotic and completely unmanageable. Without the rigid, punishing schedules of the soundstage to give her days structure, she drifted into a state of profound, suffocating depression. There were subsequent suicide attempts. In a chilling echo of the tragedy on Evanview Drive, she slashed her throat with a broken glass in a hotel bathroom, only to be found and rushed to the hospital. The tabloid press, no longer kept at bay by Howard Strickling and the MGM fixers, descended upon her like vultures. They published photographs of her looking bloated, disheveled, and terrified. They mocked her weight fluctuations. They chronicled her falls from grace with a vicious, moralizing glee, entirely ignoring the fact that the industry they served had meticulously engineered her destruction. But a machine as powerful as Judy Garland's vocal cords cannot remain silent indefinitely, and the entertainment industry abhorred a vacuum. If the film studios would no longer insure her, a new breed of manager would step in to exploit the raw, bleeding commodity she had become. Enter Sidney Luft. Sid Luft was a former test pilot, a tough, brawling, fiercely ambitious producer who recognized that Garland's exile from Hollywood did not mean her earning potential was exhausted. He saw that while the studio executives viewed her as a liability, the global public still viewed her with a profound, almost religious adoration. Luft became her manager and subsequently her third husband. Luft orchestrated one of the most remarkable, agonizing comebacks in the history of entertainment. He transitioned her away from the punishing multi-month schedules of feature films and pivoted her toward the live concert stage. In 1951, Judy Garland took the stage at the legendary London Palladium. The performances she delivered during this era were not simply concerts, they were acts of public survival. When she walked onto the stage, visibly carrying the physical and emotional scars of the previous decade, the audience did not just hear a singer, they witnessed a martyr. Garland poured every ounce of the betrayal, the addiction, the electroshock therapy, and the corporate abuse into her music. When she sang about heartbreak, she was not acting. The vibrato in her voice was the sound of a woman vibrating with untreated trauma. She sweat profusely under the spotlights, her hands often trembling, her body fighting the lingering effects of the pills she still required to function. Audiences, particularly those from marginalized communities, saw their own struggles reflected in her endurance and elevated her to a secular saint. But there was a darker, more morbid element to this adulation. The public was essentially paying to watch a star struggle to survive on stage. They waited in suspense to see if she would collapse or summon the strength to hit the final note. It was a transaction where her real-life trauma was transformed into public spectacle, and Garland, desperate for validation and financially ruined, gave them exactly what they demanded. She toured relentlessly, breaking box office records at the Palace Theater in New York. She proved to the world that she was still a massive, undeniable commercial force. Sid Luft, utilizing the momentum and the capital generated by these grueling concert tours, decided it was time to force Hollywood to accept her back. He secured a deal with Warner Brothers to produce a massive prestige musical drama that would serve as her ultimate cinematic vindication. The film was A Star is Born. Its production forced Garland to enact her own psychological autopsy on camera. Garland played Esther Blodgett, a brilliantly talented but unknown singer who is discovered by Norman Maine, an aging, heavily addicted, and self-destructive Hollywood movie star. As Esther's star rises, Norman's star falls, leading to his eventual tragic suicide by drowning in the Pacific Ocean. The parallels to Garland's own life were staggering, grotesque, and deliberately exploited by the production. She was playing the role of the rising star, but in her physical and psychological reality, she was intimately familiar with the desperate, alcoholic, self-loathing demise of Norman Maine. She had lived it. She had attempted suicide because of it. The production of A Star is Born was a nightmare that perfectly mirrored the final days of her tenure at MGM. The pressure to prove herself to the executives who had written her off was unbearable. To cope with the anxiety, the grueling hours, and the emotional demands of a script that cut far too close to the bone, Garland fell back into the only survival mechanism she knew. The pills returned. The delays returned. The unpredictable, erratic behavior returned. Sid Luft, operating as the producer, found himself playing the role of the warden, desperately trying to keep his wife sober enough to finish the picture. There is a scene in A Star is Born that stands as perhaps the most devastating piece of acting ever committed to film. Garland's character Esther sits in a dressing room, breaking down in tears as she confesses her absolute inability to stop her husband from destroying himself. "I don't know what to do," she weeps, her face contorted in agony. I'm afraid all the time." In that dressing room scene, Garland wasn't acting. She channeled 15 years of studio-induced terror directly into the lens. The director, George Cukor, simply turned on the camera and allowed the lived trauma to play out. Despite the grueling production delays and the massive budget overruns, A Star is Born was completed. When it premiered, it was hailed as a masterpiece. Garland's performance was universally recognized as a tour de force, a raw, uncompromising display of vulnerability and vocal power that redefined the musical genre. The industry, which had discarded her 4 years earlier, suddenly seemed prepared to welcome her back into the pantheon. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. It was widely considered a foregone conclusion that she would win. It was supposed to be the ultimate Hollywood redemption narrative, the fallen star, resurrected by her own undeniable genius, claiming the highest honor in the land. On the night of the Academy Awards in 1955, Garland was heavily pregnant with her third child and unable to attend the ceremony in person. The network, so confident in her victory, had set up a camera crew in her hospital room to broadcast her acceptance speech live to the world. The envelope was opened. The winner was announced. The Academy Award did not go to Judy Garland. It went to Grace Kelly for her subdued, decidedly unmusical performance in The Country Girl. The camera crew in Garland's hospital room immediately began packing up their equipment, dismantling the lights and pulling the cables, leaving her sitting in the bed, stunned and empty-handed. Groucho Marx famously sent her a telegram the next day, calling her loss the biggest robbery since Brinks. But it was far more than a robbery. It was the final, definitive betrayal. The loss of the Oscar was not merely a professional disappointment. It was a psychological death blow. It confirmed her deepest, most ingrained fear that no matter how much she bled, no matter how brilliantly she performed, and no matter how thoroughly she tore her own soul apart for their entertainment, the Hollywood establishment would never truly accept her back. They would applaud her suffering. They would profit from her concerts, but they would not grant her the institutional respect and validation she craved. They still viewed her as the broken, defective, unreliable girl they had fired in 1950. Grace Kelly represented the flawless, porcelain, untroubled perfection that Louis B. Mayer had always valued. Judy Garland represented the messy, drug-addicted, traumatized reality that the studios desperately wanted to hide. The Academy, composed of the very executives and peers who had witnessed her abuse, voted for the pristine illusion over the bloody truth. The failure of A Star is Born to secure the ultimate prize broke something permanent inside Judy Garland. It extinguished the final flickering ember of hope that she could ever find a safe harbor within the industry that had created her. The remaining years of the 1950s and the transition into the 1960s became a slow, agonizing war of attrition. The marriage to Sid Luft eventually deteriorated into a toxic cycle of financial disputes, alleged physical abuse, and bitter custody battles. She was forced to continue touring relentlessly, not out of a desire to perform, but out of sheer terrifying financial desperation. The corporate machine had successfully engineered a woman who was globally famous, instantly recognizable, and yet completely incapable of functioning in the real world. She owed massive debts to the Internal Revenue Service due to gross financial mismanagement by her handlers. She was frequently homeless, bouncing between rented hotel rooms, relying on the charity of friends and the erratic income of grueling, often humiliating concert appearances. The tragedy of her final decade was that she remained a victim of her own manufactured destruction. The addiction MGM had seeded in her youth now dictated her every move. The transition into the 1960s merely changed the venue of her exploitation. While no longer captive to MGM, she was permanently bound by the debts, the chemical dependency, and the psychological conditioning the studio had instilled in her. Garland had been trained since childhood to exist exclusively as a commodity. When she was not performing, she effectively ceased to exist in her own mind. The applause was the only metric by which she could measure her worth. And the world, sensing this desperate, bottomless hunger, continued to demand that she sing for her supper, even as her physical vessel was visibly disintegrating. By the early 1960s, Garland's financial situation was a catastrophe. Decades of gross mismanagement by her handlers, business managers, and her husband, Sid Luft, had left her owing hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Internal Revenue Service. The government seized her homes. They garnished her concert earnings. She was a global icon, a woman whose films had generated unimaginable wealth for studio executives. Yet she was practically destitute, forced to drag herself and her children from one rented hotel room to another. In 1963, a final massive corporate lifeline was extended to her, but it came wrapped in the exact same toxic conditions that had destroyed her youth. The CBS television network offered her a weekly variety series, The Judy Garland Show. The network executives promised her a stable income, a chance to clear her debts, and a platform to remind the American public of her undeniable genius. Desperate for stability, Garland signed the contract, but the executives at CBS, led by the notoriously ruthless network president James T. Aubrey, were no different from Louis B. Mayer. They did not want the complex, traumatized, brilliant woman. They wanted the sanitized, cheerful illusion of the girl from Kansas. Aubrey famously despised Garland's vulnerability. He found her physical fragility and her emotional depth uncomfortable for primetime television. He demanded that she stop touching her guests, stop talking to the audience with such raw intimacy, and simply stand center stage and belt out the hits. The network brought in a revolving door of producers and directors, constantly retooling the show, firing her trusted collaborators, and subjecting her to a relentless campaign of psychological undermining. Garland was working grueling, relentless hours, terrified of losing the paycheck that stood between her family and total financial ruin. To cope with the brutal schedule and the hostile executives, the lifelong cycle resumed. The amphetamines to get through the rehearsals, the barbiturates to come down after the taping. The television cameras of the 1960s were unforgiving. They captured the deep, dark circles under her eyes, the alarming thinness of her frame, and the sheer terror that often gripped her before she stepped into the spotlight. Despite producing some of the most extraordinary musical television ever broadcast, including iconic, staggering duets with Barbra Streisand and Liza Minnelli, CBS canceled the show after a single season. It was another public rejection, another confirmation that her authentic self was unacceptable to the corporate machine. The cancellation of the television show initiated the final irreversible downward spiral. Stripped of a steady income, Garland was forced back onto the grueling concert circuit. But she was no longer playing the prestigious, triumphant engagements of the early 1950s. She was taking whatever gigs her agents could book to keep the IRS at bay and to fund the immense pharmaceutical requirements of her daily survival. The performances in the late 1960s were a harrowing, unpredictable gamble. On some nights, the sheer force of her innate genius would override the chemicals in her bloodstream, and she would deliver vocals that left audiences weeping in the aisles. She would channel decades of heartbreak into a single phrasing of a lyric, proving that she remained the greatest entertainer of her generation. But on other nights, the body simply refused to obey. She would arrive hours late, slurring her words, forgetting her lyrics, and stumbling across the stage. When Garland faltered, the crowds did not offer empathy. They had paid for a performance, and they demanded their product. In some of the most shameful incidents of her later career, particularly during an ill-fated tour of Australia, audiences booed her, they heckled her, they threw objects at the stage, screaming insults at a woman who was visibly dying in front of them. They wanted the girl in the ruby slippers, and when they were confronted with the broken, addicted woman that the ruby slippers had created, they punished her for ruining the illusion. Her personal life, severed completely from the protective, if fraudulent, shield of her earlier marriages, became increasingly chaotic. She desperately sought a savior, someone who could manage the creditors, the promoters, and the doctors. This search led to a string of disastrous relationships and brief, chaotic marriages to men who were either ill-equipped to handle the magnitude of her trauma or actively exploiting her remaining fame. Her final husband, Mickey Deans, was a nightclub manager and a former disco promoter. They married in early 1969. Deans was not a Hollywood titan like Vincente Minnelli, nor was he a heavy-hitting producer like Sid Luft. He was a man who, by many historical accounts, struggled to protect her from the rigorous demands of the promoters who were squeezing the last drops of labor from her failing body. More tragically, he was reportedly unable or unwilling to intervene in the lethal pharmaceutical cycle that was shutting down her organs. In the winter of 1968, Garland moved to London. England had always been kinder to her than America. The British public viewed her with a deep protective affection, and she hoped to find a measure of peace and a chance to rebuild her finances across the Atlantic. She booked a 5-week run at the Talk of the Town nightclub in London. The accounts of these final performances are universally devastating. Garland was 46 years old, but her biological age, accelerated by 30 years of systemic drug abuse, starvation diets, and untreated trauma, was much older. She was terrifyingly thin. Her liver was failing. She suffered from severe pleurisy. She was physically exhausted to the core of her bones. Yet she was dragged out onto the stage night after night. There are audio recordings of these final shows. You can hear the immense agonizing effort required for her to draw breath, to push the notes past her damaged vocal cords. You can hear the desperate banter with the audience, a woman pleading for validation, begging them to love her enough to make the pain stop. The physical reality was that Judy Garland's body had been pushed beyond human limits for 3 decades. On June 22, 1969, she was found dead in a rented London house at the age of 47. The coroner ruled the cause as an incautious self-overdose of barbiturates, the very substances she had been prescribed since her teenage years at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. While Vincente Minnelli lived a long, highly decorated life protected by the industry's silence, Garland became a permanent casualty of it. Her legacy remains a testament to her unparalleled vocal genius, but it also stands as a stark, enduring indictment of the Golden Age studio system that ruthlessly commodified her talent at the ultimate expense of her life